Attention! This is not a fairy tale about a princess. This is the brutal reality of a queen whom everyone considered a pawn. Alexander Sterling, an absolute king in the concrete jungle of Manhattan, saw his wife, Victoria, as little more than a beautiful piece of decor. On the most crucial night of his career, the annual Metropolitan Legacy Gala, Alexander stood before his rivals, partners, and the press, and publicly humiliated her. He called her small, amateurish. What he ignored, as he laughed heartily, was that Victoria was about to take the throne. Because in the world of old money and new power, the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous. Sterling Heights on 5th Avenue 740 wasn't a home. It was a declaration. A fortress of beige Italian marble and glass walls that severely judged Central Park, adorned with art bought for investment value, not beauty. This was Alexander Sterling's world, and Victoria Sterling simply lived in it. Alexander was a man sculpted from granite and ambition. He was the CEO of Sterling Holdings, a real estate empire that had devoured half of the Manhattan skyline. He hadn't inherited it. He had weaponized it. Tall, with a distinguished mane of silver hair, he wore bespoke Brioni suits that seemed to repel both dust and weakness. His voice was a low murmur, and he expected, and always received, absolute obedience. And then there was Victoria. To Alexander, Victoria was his greatest acquisition. She was a Kensington. The Kensingtons were old-line aristocracy, the kind of money that whispered in the salons of the Upper East Side and owned dusty libraries in estates upstate. They possessed the one thing Alexander couldn't build, a legacy. He had married her a decade ago, merging his brute force wealth with her silent pedigree. In his eyes, the deal was simple. He gave her a life of unlimited luxury. In return, she was to be beautiful, silent, and supportive. Victoria was pale and slender, with large, observant gray eyes that most mistook for shyness. She ran the house with the silent efficiency of a Swiss timepiece. She organized his dinners, filtered his invitations, and wore the precise, elegant clothes he preferred. The blue one, not that. The one with the finer weave, he grunted, snatching a silk tie from her hands in their vast, mahogany-paneled dressing room. Arthur Kensington's speech is all that matters. He's finally retiring from the Metropolitan Legacy Fund. Tonight, they announced the new chair. The Metropolitan Legacy Fund was the unspoken god of New York philanthropy. It was a century-old institution that held the keys to the city's cultural and social future. Its approval could greenlight a new museum wing, a billion-dollar urban renewal project, or kill it entirely. The MLF chair was, in many circles, more powerful than the mayor. "Are you still sure it will be you?" Victoria asked. Her hands intertwined. Alexander finally looked at her, a smirk of smugness on his thin lips. "Victoria, it's done. My Sterling Resurgence project for the financial district is exactly the kind of bold move the MLF needs. Kensington knows I have the vision to lead the fund. The only other remotely serious contender is that tech bro, Julian Vance. And the MLF board would never give the keys to a new money disruptor from the West Coast who wears hoodies to board meetings." He straightened his tie. "This is the final piece. Once I'm chair, the Resurgence project is unstoppable. Our name will be on every building, from Wall Street to Midtown." Victoria nodded, her expression unreadable. "Of course, dear. It will be your night." "Our night, Victoria. Our night," he corrected, though his tone made it clear he meant his. "Now, make sure you wear the diamonds, the ones I bought you at Cartier after the Marbella deal. They reflect well under the lights." He strode out of the room, leaving her in his wake. Victoria stood silently for a moment, the scent of his expensive cologne hanging in the air. She looked at the 2 rejected ties, then returned to her own wing of the penthouse. Her room was different. It was smaller, filled with books, and contained a small, antique Kensington desk. She sat down, her posture unwavering, and opened a laptop. It wasn't the sleek, modern tablet Alexander had bought her. This one was older, encrypted, and password protected. She logged in. The screen wasn't filled with party plans or fashion sites. It was a complex dashboard of financial portfolios, legal documents, and encrypted message threads. For the past decade, Victoria had been the sole trustee of what remained of her family's legacy, the Kensington Trust. When her father died, the trust was nearly insolvent, bled dry by bad investments. Alexander had glanced at their books, dismissed it as petty cash, and told her to let his accountants handle the charitable deductions. He never looked again. He never knew that Victoria, the quiet wife he mistook for a doll, had inherited her grandfather's mind, a mind for numbers and strategy. While Alexander built glass towers, Victoria quietly and meticulously rebuilt a stone foundation. She had spent a decade engaged in the hobby Alexander so despised. She had attended small, unglamorous committees for libraries in Brooklyn and art programs in Harlem. But she wasn't just planning floral arrangements. She was learning. She was networking. She was identifying cracks in the city's philanthropic armor. She made small, brilliant, anonymous investments. She learned the true language of power, not the loud roars of men like Alexander, but the silent, binding signature on a contract. The Kensington Trust, once a relic, was now a silent powerhouse. Its assets had grown by 2,000%, and no one, least of all her husband, had the slightest idea. She opened a secure email from the MLF's legal counsel. It was a simple confirmation. Subject: Agenda. Item 4. All terms accepted. The transition is closed. Victoria closed the laptop. She went to her closet and looked past the beige, cream, and gray dresses Alexander preferred. In the back, hidden in a simple black suit bag, was another gown, a custom-made Oscar de la Renta in a deep, possessive shade of emerald green. She looked at her watch. 6:00 p.m. Time to put on the diamonds and play the role of Victoria Sterling one last time. The main hall of the Metropolitan Museum of Art was transformed. It wasn't just a party. It was a demonstration of hierarchy. Towering floral arrangements rose toward the vaulted ceilings. Champagne flowed from ice-carved fountains, and the air vibrated with the sound of 1,000 powerful, concise conversations. This was the Metropolitan Legacy Fund Gala, the alpha predator of New York charity events. Alexander Sterling moved through the crowd like a shark. Victoria was on his arm, a silent, perfect accessory, in a shimmering pale gold gown and the obligatory Cartier diamonds. Her smile was polite, her gaze distant. Alexander was in his element. "Senator," he boomed, grabbing a politician's shoulder. "My Resurgence project will create 10,000 jobs in your district. 10,000. "Alexander, always a pleasure," the senator replied, his eyes already scanning the room for someone more important. "Alexander!" A sharp voice cut through the murmur. Amelia Jones, the most feared social and financial columnist in the country, approached them, her pen ready like a scalpel. "Big night for you. The whispers are deafening. Everyone says you're the heir apparent." Alexander gave her his most charming, predatory smile. "Amelia, you know I'm only here to support the fund. We all want what's best for this city." "Of course," she said, her own smile equally sharp. "But your Resurgence project is controversial. Many in the preservation community call it a vanity project. that will destroy the character of the historic downtown. Alexander's smile tightened. That's small-minded talk, Amelia. You can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. Progress requires bold strokes. The MLF knows that. We shall see, she said, before her eyes landed on Victoria. And Mrs. Sterling, a pleasure as always. You're radiant. What is your role in this resurgence? Before Victoria could open her mouth, Alexander let out a loud, dismissive laugh. Victoria keeps the home running, don't you, darling? She makes sure my suits are pressed and the champagne is cold. It's a full-time job, believe me. Amelia's eyebrow raised a fraction of an inch. Victoria's polite smile did not falter, though her grip on her tiny clutch tightened. I mean, she has her own little projects, of course, Alexander continued, gesturing vaguely. The Kensington Trust. Very noble. She's on committees. They debate floral arrangements for library fundraisers. It's wonderful. Keeps her busy. He was enjoying this performance. He was positioning himself as the serious man of action, and his wife as the charming, frivolous socialite. This was the image. Across the room, a different kind of power entered. Julian Vance. He was 30 a decade younger than Alexander, and had amassed a dozen fortunes in Silicon Valley. Now he was back in his native New York, investing billions in disruptive technology and, to Alexander's disgust, in philanthropy. He wore a dark Tom Ford suit, impeccably tailored, but no tie. Alexander, Vance said, his voice soft and clear. He nodded politely. Victoria, you look stunning. There was an immediate, subtle shift in his tone. When he spoke to Alexander, it was a challenge. When he spoke to Victoria, it was with genuine, almost curious respect. Vance, Alexander responded, his voice dripping with condescension. Surprised to see you here. I thought your people were more digital. The MLF is the heart of New York, Alexander. I'm a New Yorker, Vance said simply. I just hope the fund's new leadership has a vision for the next century, not the last. This was a direct hit at Alexander's project, which was pure brick-and-mortar arrogance. Vision, Alexander scoffed. Vision isn't about apps and algorithms, son. It's about steel. It's about concrete. It's about building something permanent. Permanent can be synonymous with obsolete, Alexander, Vance countered. The future isn't about building over the city. It's about building in it, connecting communities, digital, green, sustainable infrastructure. Vance's gaze drifted from Alexander to Victoria, who had been watching the exchange with the quiet intensity of a chess master. And you, Victoria? Vance asked, ignoring her husband. What do you think the future of the city is? Steel or connection? Alexander tensed, ready to interrupt, but Victoria spoke first. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension. I believe the future, Mr. Vance, she said, meeting his eyes, is realizing that the strongest structures are built on legacy. The question is simply what kind of legacy one chooses to build. Vance stared at her for a long instant. A slow smile spread across his face. Well said, Mrs. Sterling. Very well said. Alexander, however, was furious. He hated being upstaged. He hated that Vance had addressed her. He hated the confidence in her tone. He grabbed her elbow, his fingers digging into her arm. If you'll excuse us, he growled, dragging her toward the dais. My wife and I need to greet the guest of honor. What the hell was that? He hissed in her ear, his smile still pasted on his face for the crowd. I was answering a question, Victoria said, her voice perfectly level. You don't answer questions, Victoria. You smile. You let me do the talking, especially with that punk. You made me look weak, condescending to his nonsense. He asked my opinion. Your opinion? He whispered, his voice vibrating with rage. Your opinion is whatever I tell you it is. You are a Sterling. You are my wife. Your only job tonight is to stand there, look beautiful, and not mess this up, do you understand? Victoria looked at him. Her face was pale, but her eyes were not timid. They were cold. They were the color of the ocean, just before a storm. She said nothing. She simply extracted her arm from his grip, smoothed the fabric of her gown, and locked the smile back onto her face. Alexander took her silence for submission. He was, as usual, catastrophically wrong. The main dining hall was a sea of black ties and glittering jewels. Alexander was radiating confidence at the head table, the coveted table 1, next to the podium. He had Arthur Kensington to his right and the mayor to his left. He was loud, charismatic, and utterly convinced of his imminent victory. The main course plates were cleared. The lights dimmed slightly. Amelia Jones, the columnist, materialized at their table, notepad in hand. This was highly unorthodox, but Amelia played by her own rules. "Alexander, one moment," she said, her voice low. The chatter at the table quieted. "The rumor is your resurgence project is the frontrunner for the fund's first 9-figure grant under the new chair. Any comment?" "I can only say," Alexander said, loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear, "that Sterling Holdings is profoundly committed to this city's future. We believe in building, not just talking." "But some," Amelia pressed, "say the project is entirely dependent on you being named chair, that it's a conflict of interest, that the fund would be supporting its own company." "That is slander, Amelia. The project stands on its own merits. It's the only one on the table big enough to truly matter." "And what about the opposition?" she asked. "Julian Vance's Green Connection proposal, for instance. It's smaller, more community-focused, and has a lot of popular support." Alexander let out a short, sharp laugh. "Vance? That's not a proposal. It's a pamphlet. It's a fantasy drawn on a napkin. You can't power a city with bike lanes and free Wi-Fi, Amelia. You need grit. You need steel." Then Amelia turned her pen and her attention to Victoria. It was the move of a masterful journalist, unbalancing the powerful man by addressing his silent partner. "Mrs. Sterling," Amelia said, her voice clear and precise. "You run the Kensington Trust. It's one of the oldest names in this room. Your trust focuses on community, on the arts, on the very popular efforts Mr. Vance seems to champion. What is your position on the Resurgence Project? Does the Kensington Trust endorse your husband's vision?" The table fell into absolute silence. Arthur Kensington swiveled his head, his old, intelligent eyes fixed on Victoria. Alexander saw this as an attack, a way to divide him. He saw Victoria in her pale gold dress as a liability. Before Victoria could articulate a single syllable, Alexander threw his head back and roared with laughter. It was a loud, jarring "Goomba." "Victoria," he thundered, splashing his wine. "You ask Victoria about a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure project?" He patted her hand as if she were a child. "Darling, I don't think Amelia understands. Your trust is... What is it you do again? You fund poetry readings, don't you? And you saved that little community garden in the Lower East Side. Wonderful. Very sweet." Victoria's face was a porcelain mask. "Amelia," Alexander continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "My wife is a woman of immense taste. She can tell a Monet from a Manet at 20 paces. She can organize a gala for 500 people without breaking a sweat. Her committee decides the exact shade of beige for the napkins. It's a vital skill. But as for business," he continued, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial growl, "as for power, for the real work, that she leaves to me, as it should be." He smiled triumphantly. "Her only job," he said, raising his glass in a mocking toast toward her, "is to look beautiful and hold my glass. And she does it perfectly, doesn't she, darling?" The silence that followed was heavy and cold. Amelia Jones's pen was frozen. She looked horrified. Victoria Sterling remained perfectly motionless. The blood had drained from her face, leaving her stark white against the gold of her gown. Her gray eyes locked on Alexander. There was no anger in them, no sadness, only a deep Arctic cold, a finality. She did not cry. She did not yell. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her napkin on the table. She pushed her chair back, the legs scraping lightly on the marble floor. "If you'll excuse me," she said, her voice a perfectly modulated whisper that nonetheless seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. She stood. She did not look at Amelia, nor the mayor, nor Arthur Kensington. She only looked at her husband. Then she turned and walked away from the table. She did not flee to the ladies' room. She walked calmly, with perfect posture, directly out of the main dining hall and into the lobby, disappearing from sight. Alexander watched her go, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "Drama," he muttered to the table, forcing a laugh. "Probably upset over a broken nail. She'll be back. Now, Amelia, about that conflict of interest nonsense." But no one was listening. Everyone was staring at the empty chair where Victoria had been. Arthur Kensington slowly shifted his gaze from the door to Alexander. His expression was unreadable. Across the room, at his own table, Julian Vance had observed the entire exchange. He looked at the door where Victoria had vanished. Then he looked back at the oblivious, pontificating Alexander, and Julian Vance smiled. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated anticipation. Alexander's good humor had been punctured. Victoria's exit was an embarrassment. It was a public display of dissent. He tried to recover, to steer the conversation back to his project, but the energy at the table had shifted. The smooth, steady confidence was gone, replaced by a strained courtesy. "She's sensitive," Alexander offered to the mayor, who was now meticulously studying his dessert fork. "The Kensingtons are all like that. Very temperamental, artistic." "Sure," the mayor murmured evasively. Alexander scowled. He mentally calculated the cost of this petulance. Another donation to her little trust. A new bracelet. It was infuriating. He was about to achieve the greatest triumph of his life, and she had to throw a fit over a harmless joke. It was, he thought, profoundly selfish. He glanced at his watch. 8:50 p.m. "She'll be back," he muttered to himself. "She knows she has to be here for the announcement." The lights dimmed further. The host returned to the podium. "And now," the presenter's voice filled the room, "it is my distinct honor to introduce a man who has been the custodian of our city's great legacy for 3 decades, a titan of industry, a patron of the arts, and a true New Yorker. Please welcome, for his final address as chair, the Honorable Arthur K. Kensington." The room erupted in a sustained, respectful standing ovation. Arthur, an 80-year-old man with a pin-straight back and clear blue eyes, walked slowly to the podium. He adjusted the microphone. Alexander straightened his Brioni jacket. This was his moment. Arthur tapped the microphone. The room fell silent. "Thank you." Arthur's voice was frail, but it held immense authority. "For 30 years, I have had the privilege of leading this great institution. The Metropolitan Legacy Fund is more than a collection of assets. It is the conscience of our city." He paused, looking at the sea of faces. "When I took this office," he continued, "the city was at a different time. We needed to be bold. We needed to build. We needed to show the world that New York was strong, permanent, and unyielding. We built with steel." Alexander smiled. He subtly nudged the mayor. "But the world changes," Arthur said, his tone shifting. "And the fund must change with it. The conscience of a city cannot be static. It must evolve. The challenges of the next 50 years are not the same. Brute force can build a tower, but it cannot build a future." Alexander's smile faltered. A cold knot began to form in his stomach. This was not the speech he had been led to expect. "The board and I," Arthur said, "have spent the last year in a silent, exhaustive search. We were not looking for another guardian. We were looking for a visionary. We were not looking for the loudest voice in the room." His eyes seemed to flicker for a microsecond toward Alexander. "We were looking," Arthur said, "for the smartest. We were looking for someone who understood that true, lasting power is not in the things we build for ourselves, but in the foundations we lay for others. We were looking for someone who didn't just understand legacy, but was the legacy." Alexander was no longer smiling. He was confused. This didn't sound like him. He glanced at Julian Vance's table. Vance was leaning forward, his expression intense. "Is it Vance?" The thought sent a jolt of panic through Alexander. "The board vote was unanimous," Arthur Kensington declared. "We have found a new chair, a new leader to move us all forward. For the last decade, she has been operating in plain sight, turning a near-bankrupt family trust into one of this state's most agile, powerful, and forward-thinking philanthropic engines." Alexander's blood ran cold. "A family trust? This person," Arthur said, a rare, warm smile spreading across his face, "has been on a dozen seemingly unimportant committees. This person has, without fanfare, saved libraries, funded minority startups, and anonymously endowed 3 distinct university chairs in sustainable urban development. This person has been building a new kind of legacy, one built not on noise, but on results." Alexander was drowning. He couldn't breathe. It wasn't possible. It was a joke, a horrible, elaborate joke. "It is my deep honor," Arthur Kensington said, his voice rising, "to pass the gavel of the Metropolitan Legacy Fund to its new chairwoman." Chairwoman. The entire room held its breath. Alexander Sterling's world, which had been so solid, so permanent, so made of steel, suddenly fractured. "Please join me in welcoming the new chairwoman of the Metropolitan Legacy Fund, Ms. Victoria Alcaraz Sterling." For 3 full seconds, the only sound was the hum of the air conditioning. 3 seconds of absolute, stunned silence. Alexander Sterling did not move. He simply stared, his face a mask of complete, uncomprehending shock. He looked at the empty chair beside him, as if expecting Victoria to suddenly materialize, laughing at Arthur's strange joke. Then the applause began. It started at Julian Vance's table. He stood instantly, his applause loud, genuine, and thunderous. Amelia Jones, her notepad forgotten, also rose, her face an image of stunned, ecstatic revelation. Then the mayor rose. Then the senator. Within 10 seconds, the entire room was standing, a deafening wave of applause directed not at the stage, but at the main entrance to the hall. Alexander swiveled in his chair. A single, bright white spotlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the grand archway. And there she was. This was not the woman who had left the table. The pale, trembling, humiliated wife in the gold gown was gone. The woman under the spotlight was a queen. She wore a gown of deep, luminous emerald green, a custom-made Oscar de la Renta, cut with an architectural precision, severe and stunning. It had long sleeves, a high neck, and a bodice as structured as armor. Her pale skin and dark hair, now pulled into a severe, elegant chignon, were in sharp contrast. The Cartier diamonds were gone. In their place was one stunning, unique piece, the Kensington Parure, a waterfall of emeralds and diamonds not seen in public in 50 years. She did not wear a literal crown. She did not need one. She entered the room, not with the hesitant side glance of a socialite, but with the measured, unhurried stride of a predator who owns the territory. Her face was serene, her gray eyes scanning the room, acknowledging the applause with a slight, graceful nod. She did not look at table 1. She did not look at her husband. She walked directly to the stage, shook Arthur Kensington's hand, and accepted the light, symbolic gavel he offered. She turned to the audience, standing at the podium where Arthur had just spoken. The applause slowly subsided as people sat down, craning their necks, their minds reeling. Alexander was still standing, frozen next to his table. He looked like a statue, a monument to his own obsolete power. Victoria adjusted the microphone, gave a small tap, and waited. "Thank you, Arthur," she said. Her voice was not the whisper he was accustomed to. It was clear, crisp, and amplified, ringing with a musical authority that filled every corner of the vast hall. "Thank you to the board, and to all of you. For generations," she began, looking out at the room. "The Metropolitan Legacy Fund has been the bedrock of our city. It has been, as Arthur so rightly said, our strength, our steel. But the city is changing. The world is changing. And legacy is not a monument you build and abandon. It is a garden. It must be tended. It must be nurtured. And sometimes," her eyes swept the room, "it must be pruned." A nervous murmur rippled through the crowd. "The fund's mission must evolve," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "We can no longer afford to fund monuments to the past. Or," she paused, "monuments to ego." Alexander Sterling physically recoiled. It was public murder. "Effective tonight," Victoria declared. "The MLF is pivoting. Our primary focus will no longer be on single-developer, large-scale projects. Our focus will be on sustainable community, digital equity, and green infrastructure. We will fund the connective tissue of our city, the libraries, the parks, the public data networks, the educational programs." She was dismantling Alexander's entire resurgence project piece by piece. She was declaring it, and him, obsolete in front of the very people he needed to impress. "The old way of doing things is over," she said. "The era of the vanity project is dead." Amelia Jones was writing so fast, her pen was a blur. The mayor nodded with a sudden political smile on his face, as if this had been his idea all along. "This is not just a promise," Victoria said. "It is a strategy, and it begins tonight. The MLF is proud to announce its first new initiative, the Green Connection Charter, a $500 million grant to revitalize and digitally integrate our community spaces." Alexander's hands were clenched so tight his knuckles were white. He was trembling. "And," Victoria said, a small, dangerous smile playing on her lips, "to show that we are serious about a new way of collaboration. Combining the old legacy with a new vision, the MLF will not be funding this initiative alone. We are proud to announce our new lead partner in this venture." She looked directly at Julian Vance. "The Metropolitan Legacy Fund is officially partnering with the Vance Foundation." Vance stood, a wide, brilliant smile on his face. He bowed his head slightly toward Victoria. She nodded. It was a coronation, a new king and queen anointed. Alexander Sterling finally collapsed back into his chair. He had not merely been defeated, he had been annihilated. He was a ghost at his own funeral. Victoria's eyes finally moved to table 1. They passed the mayor, past the empty plates, and settled on her husband. She looked at the broken, white-faced, stammering man who an hour ago had told her to hold his glass. "True legacy," she said, her voice dropping, but her message clear, "is not about the name you build on a tower. It's about the one you build on a foundation. The MLF is now committed to building that foundation for all of New York. Thank you." The rest of the gala was a blur for Alexander. He was a non-entity. The people who had clapped him on the back an hour before were now giving him wide, pitying berths. He watched from a distance as a crowd formed around Victoria. Julian Vance was by her side. The mayor was laughing, his arm around her shoulder. Victoria was radiant. She was fluent without effort about bond issuances, zoning laws, and fiber optic partnerships. She was, Alexander realized with a nauseating pang, a genius. And she had hidden it. She had hidden all of it behind a mask of beige compliance for 10 years. He walked out of the Gala, not even bothering to retrieve his coat. He stood on the grand steps of the Met. The cold night air, hitting his face like a slap, was all he felt. The drive back to Fifth Avenue was silent. He paced the vast marble living room, his tie ripped off, his jacket thrown onto the floor, when he heard the soft click of the private elevator. She entered. She still wore the emerald gown, the Kensington jewels resting on her collarbones. She looked, if possible, even more powerful in the sterile, modern environment of their home. She walked past him, heading to the bar. "You!" he finally spat, his voice a hoarse, grating croak. You bitch!" Victoria stopped. She turned, not with fear, but with a kind of clinical curiosity. She poured herself a small glass of water. "You planned this?" he accused, his voice rising to a shout. "You humiliated me. You destroyed my project. You destroyed me." "Your project was an inflated, over-leveraged monument to your own ego, Alexander," she said, her voice as calm as the water in her glass. "It would have bankrupted the fund and displaced 5,000 people. It was a bad business deal. I killed a bad business deal." You're a housewife!" He roared the word, sounding ridiculous even to his own ears. You plan parties! You flowers!" "And napkins." Victoria took a small sip of water. "Yes, the napkins. While I was deciding the exact shade of beige, I was also listening. I was listening to the mayor complain about his budget shortfalls. I was listening to the hedge fund managers complain about your leverage. I was listening to the community leaders in Harlem, whom you never even met. You thought I was wallpaper, Alexander, and you were too arrogant to look closely at the pattern. The Kensington Trust. It's nothing, he screamed. It's petty cash. It was, she corrected. When you signed it over to me, it was worth about $4 million. This morning, the liquid assets of the Kensington Trust are valued at just over $1.2 billion. Alexander stopped. He couldn't process the number. $1.2 billion. How? You build with steel. I build with information. While you were making hostile takeovers, I was making silent, strategic seed investments. You like to buy companies. I like to fund founders. You'd be surprised what a $100,000 investment in a biotech firm 10 years ago is worth today. Or a small data processing company. One that, incidentally, Julian Vance's fund later acquired. He and I have been moving in the same circles for years, Alexander. You just never thought to ask who was in the room with me. You used me, he whispered, the rage turning into a cold, nauseating dread. You used me, she countered, her voice hardening for the first time. You married me for my name. You used me as an accessory. You silenced me, dismissed me, and belittled me. You thought I was an asset, and you were right. I was. Just not your asset. The dread in his stomach was now pure, unadulterated terror. He was finally seeing the chessboard. The MLF chairmanship, he stammered. Kensington, he didn't just... Arthur Kensington was my father's godfather, Victoria stated flatly. He has been my mentor since I was 20 years old. He asked me to take over the fund 3 years ago. I told him I wasn't ready. I told him I had one last piece of unfinished business. What business? Alexander whispered. Victoria walked to her antique desk in the corner. She opened a drawer and pulled out a thick, leather-bound portfolio. She slid it across the marble coffee table toward him. Sterling Holdings, she said. He opened it. His eyes scanned the pages. His face grew paler with every line. It was a breakdown of his company, his debt, his leveraged assets, and at the end, a list of his primary, secondary, and tertiary creditors. He looked up. What is this? Remember Phoenix Capital Group? She asked. The anonymous Asian fund that saved your Alcala Street deal 5 years ago? The one that bought up all your toxic debt and restructured it? He stared, bewildered. They saved me. That was me, Victoria said. Alexander's world wobbled on its axis. It was the Kensington Trust's first major acquisition, she explained. You were over-leveraged. You were about to lose everything. I couldn't allow that. I needed you to stay on top. I needed you to keep building, to keep borrowing, to keep expanding, to keep digging your own grave. I have been your primary creditor for 5 years, Alexander. He looked at her, mouth agape. No sound coming out. He was a fly in a web he had never seen. You don't just own me, he whispered. I own this apartment, she said. I own the car you ride in. I own the Sterling Resurgence Project, which I will officially dissolve tomorrow morning at the first MLF board meeting. I own you. She let that hang in the air. The final truth. Brutal and undeniable. Alexander Sterling, the man of granite and ambition, finally broke. He didn't just sit. He collapsed onto the cream-colored sofa. His body, moments before vibrant with rage, was now utterly slack. He buried his head in his hands, his elbows on his knees. The Brioni suit, his armor, felt cheap and heavy, like a costume. He was ruined. It wasn't just the money. It wasn't just the MLF chairmanship. It was the overwhelming, choking totality of his defeat. It was the realization that his entire life, his entire empire, had been a play directed by the one person he hadn't even considered an actor. He had been playing checkers against a grand master, and she had been playing for a decade. Why? He finally asked. His voice was not a roar. It was a dry, hollow croak that was swallowed by the cavernous room. Why? All this? 10 years, Victoria. Why not just leave me? Victoria stood by the window, her back to him, looking out at the glittering expanse of Central Park. The emerald of her dress seemed to absorb the city lights. Leave you, Alexander? She said, her voice quiet and thoughtful. That would have been incomplete. That would have been an emotional act. This was never about emotion. This was about restoration. She turned. Her face was not filled with hatred, or even triumph. It was the dispassionate, objective face of a CEO who had just successfully completed a hostile acquisition. You were destroying my family's name, she stated simply. You didn't just marry me, you consumed my legacy. You took the Kensington name, a name that meant something in this city, and you turned it into a joke, a footnote in the social pages. The quiet, pretty, stupid wife of Alexander Sterling. She began to walk slowly toward him, her heels clicking with the finality of a marble floor. My grandfather, Robert Kensington, endowed the City University's School of Engineering. My mother, Carmen Kensington, funded the first free women's clinic in this city. They built foundations. They built futures. She stopped, standing over him. And you? She said, her voice dropping to a whisper of profound contempt. Had their descendant? Me? Reduced to a photograph in Vogue, complimented on my impeccable taste in napkins. The word hung in the air, vibrating with a decade of suppressed fury. I didn't do this for revenge, Alexander. Revenge is a messy, passionate thing. This, she said, gesturing to the room, to the city, toward him, was a correction. I was restoring the Kensington legacy, and to do that, I had to completely and surgically dismantle the Sterling one. He looked up from his hands, his face ashen. The full, horrifying scope of his arrogance was finally crashing down on him. You were so desperate to prove you were the smartest man in the room, she said. You never stopped to think about who else was in it. Your contempt for me was the most valuable asset I had. It was the perfect cover. Tonight, he stammered, the memory of his own voice, his own public mockery hitting him like a physical blow. At the table, when I said those things you already knew. I let you be you, Alexander, she said. That was all that was required. And now what? He asked, his voice the plea of a broken man. What happens? You liquidate me? Throw me out on the street? Don't be dramatic, she said, her voice devoid of pity. This isn't a soap opera. This is a transaction. She walked to the massive glass coffee table. From her small emerald clutch, she pulled a key and unlocked a drawer in the antique Kensington desk. She brought out 2 leather-bound portfolios. At 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, she said, placing the first one in front of him. Sterling Holdings and all its subsidiaries will be officially absorbed into a new urban development arm of the Kensington Trust, an arm I will chair in conjunction with my MLF duties. He stared at the cover, his own logo, but did not open it. The Sterling name will cease to exist in the market, she continued, as if reading a financial report. The Resurgence project is dead, as I said. Your services are no longer required. That phrase, the cold corporate dismissal, hit him harder than any shout. He had been fired from his own life. But I am, he stammered, gesturing futilely between them. I am your husband. You are not, she said, placing the thinner, blue-backed second document on top of the first. Divorce papers. He stared at them. Sterling v. Sterling. It was the final, clean, surgical cut. My attorney, Mr. Hidalgo, is waiting in the lobby, she said. He will come up in 5 minutes to collect your signature. I have already signed. Alexander let out a sound, a rough, choked laugh. You expect me to fight this? With what grounds? With what money? Exactly, she said. You are not in a position to. The terms are clean. I am not a cruel woman, Alexander. Only thorough. You will be left with a small, stipendiary trust. It has already been funded. She paused. Enough to maintain your club membership and live comfortably. But you will never build or borrow or matter in this city again. You will be, in effect, an amateur. The reference to his own insult was so precise, so devastating, it took his breath away. You have been my tenant. She pointed to the great entrance. Beside the door, a single, modest black suitcase sat alone. Your personal effects have been packed. You will stay at the club, temporarily, of course. Where you go after that is your concern. A lifetime, an empire, reduced to one piece of carry-on luggage. He took the heavy, expensive pen from the table. His hand trembled, but he opened the file. He found the signature line. The sound of the tip scratching the thick linen paper was deafening. The death of his world signed in triplicate. He slid the document back across the table. Did you think of everything? He muttered. It wasn't a question. She said. I did. She turned and walked to the private elevator. She had taken off the heavy Kensington necklace and was rubbing the skin of her collarbones. A small, tired, human gesture. The armor was coming off. The job was done. She pressed the call button. Victoria, he said, his voice raw. She stopped, her hand on the opening elevator door, but she did not turn around. That joke I made tonight, he stammered, the shame finally burning in his throat. At the table, about you holding my glass. I remember, she said, her voice quiet. It was the truth, Alexander. He looked up, confused. It was the only true thing you said all night. You just misidentified the roles. She stepped into the mirrored elevator and turned to look at him one last time. The woman he never saw, in the emerald gown. her gray eyes as clear and cold as winter. "You see," she said, as the heavy brass doors began to close, "you were never the king. You were just the man holding my glass while I bought the bar." The doors closed with a soft, final sigh, sealing him in. He was left alone in the vast, empty penthouse, with nothing but a suitcase and the resounding silence of his own magnificent, catastrophic failure. In the end, Alexander Sterling signed the papers. He vanished from the world of power, a ghost haunting the clubs he used to own. Amelia Jones's article about the Gala coup became the most read in the country's history, a modern legend of power, arrogance, and the quiet, invisible genius of Victoria Alcaraz Sterling. She kept the name for the trust, not the man. Victoria, of course, thrived as the chairwoman of the MLF and head of the Kensington Trust. She and Julian Vance fundamentally remade the city, focusing on the very communities Alexander had scorned. She was never caught hunting again. She didn't need to be. She was too busy building her own legacy, one of steel, yes, but of a stronger steel. The kind forged in silence, patience, and an absolutely unshakable purpose. What did you think of Victoria's decade-long plan? Was it brilliant, or was it cold-blooded? Leave us your comments below.